Preston Montgomery had crushed environmental activists, silenced community lawyers, and bought his way out of every legal challenge for 15 years. His $3.2 billion shipping empire made him untouchable, or so he thought. But when he decided to bulldoze through Rainier Valley to expand his Seattle operations, he made one fatal miscalculation. He underestimated Keisha Washington. What this brilliant black maritime lawyer was about to unleash would strip away his fortune, his reputation, and everything he believed made him invincible. Sometimes the wrong person to mess with is exactly the right person to save your soul. Before we start, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video and comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's continue. The crisp October morning painted Seattle's Elliott Bay in shades of silver and gold as Preston Montgomery stood behind the expansive glass walls of his corner office on the 47th floor of Columbia Center. At 42, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that made boardrooms fall silent. 6'2" with perfectly styled dark hair touched with distinguished silver at the temples, wearing a tailored navy Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. His steel-gray eyes surveyed his shipping empire's domain. Dozens of Montgomery maritime vessels dotting the harbor like chess pieces on his personal board. Sir, the Belltown Community Legal Center has filed an injunction against the port expansion project, his assistant, Bradley, announced nervously from the doorway. Preston didn't turn around. In his mind, obstacles were simply stepping stones to greater victories. Handle it. Whatever they want, triple it and make them go away. Sir, they're not asking for money. They're demanding we halt construction due to environmental impact studies and community displacement concerns. Now Preston turned, his expression shifting to the cold calculation that had built Montgomery Maritime into the Pacific Northwest's largest shipping operation. Community displacement. Bradley, I'm displacing 3 warehouses and a parking lot to create 2,000 jobs. What community? The Rainier Valley neighborhood, sir. Apparently, the legal center represents the families who will lose their homes when we reroute the freight lines. Preston's jaw tightened. He'd spent 18 months planning this expansion, investing $500 million in preliminary infrastructure. The Seattle City Council had already approved the project after substantial contributions to various campaigns. This was supposed to be a formality. Who's heading this legal center? Bradley consulted his tablet. A woman named Keisha Washington. Former Coast Guard, maritime law specialist, graduated summa cum laude from University of Washington Law. She's been running the clinic for 3 years. Schedule a meeting. Tomorrow morning. I'll handle this personally. As Bradley left, Preston returned to his harbor view. He'd built his empire on the principle that everything had a price. Everyone had a price. This Keisha Washington would learn that lesson soon enough. 23 miles south in Rainier Valley, Keisha Washington knelt beside 7-year-old Marcus Johnson on the cracked sidewalk outside Rosa Parks Elementary School, helping him tie his shoelaces while his grandmother watched from their front porch. The October air carried the scent of coffee from the nearby roastery and the sound of children's laughter mixing with distant ship horns from the harbor. Miss Keisha, are we really gonna have to move? Marcus asked, his dark eyes wide with worry. Keisha's heart clenched. At 35, she'd learned to armor herself in professional competence, but children's fears always found the cracks in her defenses. She wore a burgundy blazer over dark jeans, her natural hair styled in a protective twist-out that framed her warm brown face. Her deep brown eyes held the kind of intensity that came from fighting battles most people never knew existed. Not if I can help it, baby, she said, though uncertainty gnawed at her stomach like acid. Standing, she waved to Mrs. Johnson, who'd lived in this house for 37 years, raising 6 children and now helping with grandchildren. The entire block told similar stories. Families who'd built lives here, created community here, deserved to stay here. Keisha's phone buzzed with a text from her law partner, Jerome. Montgomery's office called. Wants a meeting tomorrow morning. Downtown. This could be good news. She stared at the message, then at the modest houses lining the street, each one representing a family's dreams. In her experience, when billionaires wanted meetings, it usually meant they were preparing to throw money at problems until those problems disappeared. But Keisha Washington wasn't a problem that could be bought. Her phone rang. Her mother calling from Houston. "Hey, Mama. Baby girl, I saw the news about your case online. That Montgomery man is serious money. You sure you want to go up against someone like that?" Keisha's grip tightened on her phone. Her mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families for 25 years, learned to make herself invisible around people with power. "Mama, I didn't spend 4 years in the Coast Guard and 3 years in law school to back down from bullies with big bank accounts." "I know, honey. I worry. These kinds of men, they don't like being told no. And you know how things can get when..." "When what, Mama?" A pause. "When folks like us challenge folks like them." After hanging up, Keisha stood in front of her office, a converted storefront with hand-painted signage reading Belltown Community Legal Center, Justice for All. Through the window, she could see Jerome reviewing case files at one of their second-hand desks, surrounded by towers of legal documents and community testimonials. Tomorrow's meeting would determine whether Preston Montgomery was the reasonable businessman his PR team portrayed, or the ruthless corporate predator his track record suggested. Either way, Keisha had never walked away from a fight worth fighting. She pulled out her tablet and began researching everything she could find about Montgomery Maritime's environmental violations, labor disputes, and community impact studies. If Preston Montgomery thought his money made him untouchable, he was about to discover that some people couldn't be bought, bullied, or dismissed. The autumn wind picked up, scattering golden leaves across the sidewalk as Keisha headed into her office to prepare for war. The Montgomery Maritime boardroom occupied the entire northeast corner of the 47th floor, its polished mahogany table reflecting the gray October sky outside. Preston arrived 15 minutes early, a strategic move he'd learned from his father. Control the environment, control the narrative. He'd chosen his charcoal Armani suit carefully, paired with a burgundy tie that conveyed both authority and approachability. The morning light caught the platinum Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, a subtle reminder of the resources at his disposal. At exactly 9 a.m., his secretary knocked. "Mr. Montgomery, Ms. Washington has arrived. Send her in." Preston had prepared for many scenarios: an aging activist seeking one last crusade, a young idealist he could mentor into submission, perhaps even an opportunistic lawyer angling for a settlement. What walked through his door shattered every expectation. Keisha Washington entered with the bearing of someone accustomed to being the only woman in rooms full of men who underestimated her. She wore a tailored emerald blazer that complemented her rich brown skin, with matching slacks and low heels that added to her already impressive 5'8" frame. Her hair fell in natural curls to her shoulders, and her dark eyes surveyed the opulent boardroom with analytical precision rather than intimidation. "Mr. Montgomery." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd commanded Coast Guard vessels through Pacific storms. She didn't extend her hand. "Ms. Washington, please have a seat." Preston gestured to the chair across from him, noting how she chose to sit at the far end of the table instead. Maintaining distance, refusing to be positioned as subordinate. "I'll stand, thank you. I assume this won't take long." The first crack in Preston's confidence appeared. In 20 years of negotiations, no one had ever refused his hospitality so directly. "Coffee. Water. I have an excellent Ethiopian blend flown in weekly. I'm here about the families you're displacing, not your coffee preferences." Preston's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He'd built his fortune on reading people, finding their pressure points, their prices. But Keisha Washington looked at him like she was seeing straight through his expensive suit to something she found deeply lacking. "Ms. Washington, I think there's been a misunderstanding. The port expansion project will bring significant economic benefits to Seattle. 2,000 permanent jobs, increased tax revenue, modernized infrastructure, and 67 families losing their homes." Keisha's voice cut through his rehearsed pitch. Elderly residents forced from neighborhoods they've called home for decades. Children pulled from schools. Small businesses demolished to make room for your freight lines. Those residents will be fairly compensated. Market value plus a 20% premium. Keisha's laugh held no humor. Market value determined by whom? Your real estate division? The same company that somehow assessed Mrs. Dorothy Johnson's 3-bedroom house at $40,000 below what she paid for it 30 years ago. Preston felt heat rising in his chest. He stood, using his height advantage instinctively. "Ms. Washington, I understand your concern for your clients, but this project is already approved. The permits are filed, the financing secured. Perhaps we should discuss more practical solutions. Such as, the community legal center's operational costs must be significant. Pro bono work is admirable, but it doesn't pay the bills. I'm prepared to make a substantial donation, say $2 million, to help expand your services to other communities that might benefit more from your expertise." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Keisha's expression shifted from professional distance to something far more dangerous. "Are you trying to bribe me, Mr. Montgomery? I'm offering to support your mission in a way that helps more people than a futile legal battle against inevitability." Keisha stepped closer, close enough that Preston caught the subtle scent of her perfume, something warm and complex that contrasted sharply with her ice-cold demeanor. "Let me make something clear. I didn't serve 4 years protecting American waters so that entitled trust fund babies could bulldoze communities for profit. I didn't earn my law degree to be bought off by men who think their bank accounts make them gods." "Ms. Washington, I'm not finished." Her voice carried the command authority that had once directed Coast Guard operations. "You sit in your glass tower making decisions about people you've never met, in communities you've never visited, destroying lives you'll never have to think about again. You believe your money makes you untouchable, that your wealth exempts you from consequences." Preston felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Not anger, but something deeper, more unsettling. When was the last time someone had spoken to him with such fearless honesty? "You're wrong about one thing," he said quietly. "Which is, I do think about the consequences. Every decision I make affects thousands of employees, millions in pension funds, entire economic ecosystems. The weight of that responsibility is something you clearly don't understand." Keisha's eyes flashed. "Responsibility. You want to talk about responsibility?" Mrs. Johnson worked 3 jobs to buy her house. She raised 6 children there, buried her husband from that front porch, taught her grandchildren to ride bikes on that sidewalk. That house isn't just property to her. It's 37 years of love, struggle, and dreams. And you want to erase it for a shipping lane. Business requires difficult choices. This isn't business. This is greed disguised as progress. The words hit Preston like a physical blow. He'd built his identity around being a visionary, a job creator, a force for economic growth. To be called simply greedy by this woman who clearly knew nothing about the complexities of global commerce struck deeper than any boardroom criticism. "You don't know anything about me," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I know enough. I know you inherited Daddy's company and think that makes you self-made. I know you've never worried about rent, never wondered where your next meal would come from, never had to choose between medication and groceries. I know you've surrounded yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear until you actually believe your money makes you better than everyone else. And what about you? Preston's professional mask slipped entirely. What makes you so righteous? You think putting on a uniform makes you noble? You think working for free makes you pure? At least I'm honest about what I want. What you want is to win, regardless of who gets hurt. What I want is to protect people who can't protect themselves. If you can't see the difference, then this conversation is over. Keisha turned toward the door, and Preston felt panic, actual panic, at the thought of her leaving. When was the last time someone had challenged him so completely? When was the last time anyone had refused to be impressed by his accomplishments, his power, his wealth? Wait. She paused but didn't turn around. What would it take? Really? Not money, not donations. What would it take for you to drop this case? Now she turned, and Preston saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. Not anger, but disappointment. As if she'd hoped for better and found exactly what she'd expected. It would take you caring more about those families than you do about your profit margins. It would take you seeing them as human beings instead of obstacles. It would take you being a man instead of just a bank account with an ego. She headed for the door again. You can't stop this project, Preston called after her, his voice rougher than intended. You know that, right? You're fighting a battle you can't win. Keisha paused with her hand on the door handle. Mr. Montgomery, I've been fighting battles I couldn't win my whole life. The difference is, I fight them anyway. After she left, Preston stood alone in his boardroom, surrounded by the trappings of success that suddenly felt hollow. He walked to the windows overlooking Elliott Bay, watching the Montgomery maritime ships navigate the harbor below. For the first time in years, he wondered if building an empire was worth it if you had to crush dreams to lay the foundation. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Expensive suit, perfect hair, everything money could buy. But behind his own image, he could still see Keisha Washington's eyes, holding him accountable for things he'd never allowed himself to question. Preston had expected to handle a simple legal obstacle. Instead, he'd encountered a woman who looked at his billions and saw not success, but moral failure. A woman who challenged not just his business decisions, but his fundamental worth as a human being. For the first time in his privileged life, Preston Montgomery wondered if he was the villain in someone else's story. Preston Montgomery hadn't slept properly in 3 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Keisha Washington's voice cutting through his justifications like a scalpel through silk. You've surrounded yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear until you actually believe your money makes you better than everyone else. Thursday morning found him pacing his penthouse apartment in Belltown, still wearing yesterday's clothes, a rare crack in his usually impeccable presentation. The October rain drummed against the windows as he stared at his reflection in the dark glass. His father's voice echoed from childhood. Preston, weakness is a luxury we can't afford. Show them teeth, or they'll eat you alive. His phone buzzed with the 4th call from his legal team this morning. What is it, Patterson? Preston answered without looking away from the window. Sir, we've got a problem. Washington's team filed 3 additional motions yesterday: environmental impact review, historical preservation status for the Rainier Valley neighborhood, and a discrimination suit claiming the project disproportionately affects communities of color. Preston's grip tightened on his phone. Handle it. That's what I pay you for. Sir, she's not playing by normal rules. Usually, community lawyers settle for token compensation or symbolic victories. She's actually trying to stop the project entirely. My contacts at City Hall say she's building a coalition, environmental groups, civil rights organizations, even some maritime unions. Then break the coalition. Find their weak spots. A pause. Sir, there's something else. She's requested all internal communications regarding the project dating back 2 years. All emails, memos, board minutes. Preston's blood turned to ice. Buried in those communications were discussions about strategic property devaluations, timing permit applications to avoid public comment periods, and several conversations about making the neighborhood less appealing to current residents. Deny the request. Executive privilege, trade secrets, whatever it takes. We can delay, but we can't deny entirely. And sir, there's already media interest. The Seattle Times is running a piece tomorrow about David versus Goliath legal battles. After hanging up, Preston found himself doing something he hadn't done in 15 years. He drove to see his mother. Eleanor Montgomery lived in a restored Victorian mansion on Queen and Hill, surrounded by old money elegance and older regrets. At 71, she maintained the same steel-backed posture that had intimidated Seattle society for 5 decades. Her silver hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a cream cashmere sweater that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Preston. She didn't look up from her afternoon tea service. You look terrible. Thanks, Mother. Always a comfort. He collapsed into the antique armchair across from her, noting how even in his mother's parlor, he felt like he was performing a role. The port expansion project, I assume? Eleanor's pale blue eyes studied him with surgical precision. Martha Whitfield called. Said some upstart lawyer is causing trouble. It's under control. Is it? Because you look like a man who's losing sleep over a woman. Preston's head snapped up. It's not about. This is business, Mother. Eleanor's laugh held decades of disappointment. Oh, darling. I've watched you manipulate board meetings since you were 25. I've seen you destroy competitors without blinking. But I've never seen you pace like a caged animal over a quarterly report. She called me a trust fund baby. The words escaped before Preston could stop them. How accurate! Eleanor sipped her tea calmly. Is that what's bothering you? Being seen clearly. I've built Montgomery Maritime into. You've expanded what your father built. Competently, I'll grant you. But let's not confuse inheritance with creation. Eleanor set down her teacup with precise control. Tell me about this woman. Preston found himself describing Keisha Washington, her fearless confrontation, her unwavering principles, the way she'd looked at his wealth like it was evidence of moral bankruptcy rather than success. His mother listened without interruption, occasionally raising an eyebrow. She sounds terrifying, Eleanor said when he finished. She's infuriating. Completely unreasonable. She won't listen to logic, won't accept compromise. She sounds like the first honest person you've encountered in years. Preston stared at his mother. Whose side are you on? Yours, unfortunately. But perhaps it's time you considered whether winning this battle is worth losing whatever's left of your soul. Meanwhile, across the city, Keisha Washington stood in her tiny apartment kitchen at 11:47 p.m., surrounded by case files that covered every available surface. Her natural hair was wrapped in a colorful headscarf, and she wore an oversized University of Washington law sweatshirt over leggings. The October rain created a rhythm against her windows that should have been soothing but only emphasized how alone she felt in this fight. Her phone rang, Jerome calling from his home office. Please tell me you found something we can use, she answered. Define something. I've got circumstantial evidence of property manipulation, suspicious timing on permit applications, and what looks like coordinated pressure on local businesses to sell. But nothing that screams criminal behavior. Keisha rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of 67 families' hopes pressing down on her shoulders. He's too smart to leave obvious fingerprints. Keisha, I have to ask. Are you sure this is about the case? What do you mean? I mean, you've taken on plenty of powerful opponents before. But I've never seen you this invested, this angry. Keisha stared at her reflection in the dark kitchen window. Was Jerome right? Was this about more than protecting the community? He looked at me like I was nothing, Jerome. Like my principles were quaint, my clients were obstacles, my entire life's work was just noise. He sat there in his $1,000 suit, in his glass tower, and tried to buy me off like I was some small-town lawyer impressed by big city money. And that bothered you because he represents everything wrong with this system. Because men like him destroy communities every day and sleep peacefully in their silk sheets. Because, she stopped, recognizing the tremor in her own voice. Because he reminded you of Marcus. Keisha's breath caught. Marcus Thornton, her ex-fiancé, another wealthy man who'd loved her intelligence right up until she used it to challenge his worldview. Who'd left her 3 days before their wedding because he needed a wife who would support his vision rather than question his ethics. This isn't about Marcus, isn't it? Rich guy thinks his money makes him right, tries to control you when you won't fall in line, gets angry when you refuse to be impressed by his success. Keisha sank into her kitchen chair, surrounded by legal briefs and community testimonials. Even if you're right, it doesn't change anything. Those families need protection. Preston Montgomery needs to learn that some things aren't for sale. Just be careful, okay? When the personal gets mixed up with the professional, people get hurt. After hanging up, Keisha walked to her living room window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Preston Montgomery was probably in his penthouse, surrounded by luxury, confident that his wealth would eventually win this battle. He'd never worried about eviction notices, never chosen between rent and groceries, never had to prove his worth to people who assumed his success was unearned. But she'd seen something in his eyes during their confrontation, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even vulnerability. For just a moment, when she'd challenged his fundamental assumptions about himself, he'd looked almost lost. Keisha shook her head, annoyed at herself for even thinking about Preston Montgomery as a human being rather than an opponent. Tomorrow she had depositions to prepare, community meetings to organize, and a battle to fight against someone who had every advantage except one. She was right, and deep down, they both knew it. The rain continued its steady rhythm against her windows as Keisha returned to her case files, determined to find the weakness in Preston Montgomery's seemingly impenetrable armor. What she didn't expect was that the weakness might not be in his business practices, but in his carefully guarded heart. The November morning brought news that neither Preston nor Keisha had anticipated. Federal Maritime Commission investigators had launched a surprise audit of Montgomery Maritime's operations, triggered by anonymous complaints about environmental violations and potential corruption in the port expansion project approval process. Both sides found themselves summoned to a week-long series of depositions, hearings, and evidence presentations at the federal building in downtown Seattle. Preston arrived at the imposing granite courthouse wearing a charcoal Armani suit, his jaw set with determination. He'd spent the weekend strategizing with his legal team, convinced this federal intervention was somehow Keisha's doing. When the elevator doors opened on the 7th floor, he came face to face with the woman who'd been haunting his thoughts for 3 weeks. Keisha stood in the hallway wearing a sharp black pantsuit with a ruby red blouse that complemented her warm brown skin. Her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo that showcased small gold earrings, professional but unmistakably her own style. She carried a worn leather briefcase that had seen years of battles, and when their eyes met, neither looked away. "Mr. Montgomery." Her voice was cool, professional. "Ms. Washington." He noticed the way she held herself, shoulders back, chin raised, ready for whatever came next. "Interesting timing for a federal audit," Preston said, unable to keep the accusation from his voice. Keisha's eyebrows rose slightly. "You think I have that kind of influence with federal agencies?" I'm flattered by your overestimation of my power." Before Preston could respond, federal investigator Carmen Rodriguez emerged from the conference room. A no-nonsense woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd seen every corporate game played and won none of them amusing. "Mr. Montgomery, Ms. Washington, please join us. We'll be here for the next week, so I suggest you both get comfortable with uncomfortable conversations." The first 3 days were brutal. Preston watched his pristine corporate image dissected piece by piece as investigators presented email chains, financial records, and recorded phone calls that painted Montgomery Maritime's expansion as a calculated assault on a vulnerable community. Worse, he found himself sitting just feet away from Keisha, acutely aware of her presence even as she methodically destroyed his case with precise legal arguments and compelling evidence. During breaks, they found themselves in the same courthouse cafe, avoiding eye contact while ordering coffee. Preston noticed Keisha always ordered the same thing: black coffee with a single sugar packet, as if she'd trained herself to need very little and expect even less. On Wednesday, when she struggled to balance her briefcase, coffee, and a stack of documents, Preston found himself reaching out to help before catching himself. "I don't need," Keisha started. "I know you don't need anything," Preston interrupted, steadying her briefcase anyway. "But gravity doesn't care about your independence." For a moment, their hands touched on the briefcase handle. Keisha looked up at him, startled by the unexpected gesture. Preston caught a hint of jasmine perfume and noticed a small scar above her left eyebrow, evidence of some past battle fought and won. "Thank you," she said quietly, her professional armor slipping just enough to show the woman underneath. Thursday afternoon brought the bombshell neither had expected. Investigator Rodriguez presented evidence that Montgomery Maritime's environmental violations weren't limited to the current project. They dated back 5 years and included illegal dumping in Puget Sound, falsified safety inspections, and bribes to Port Authority officials. The worst part: Preston's father had signed most of the documents, meaning Preston had inherited not just a shipping empire, but a legacy of environmental crimes. Preston's face went ashen as Rodriguez read through the violations. Every illegal shortcut, every bribed official, every ton of contaminated water. It painted a picture of systematic corporate malfeasance that made his current battle with Keisha look like a minor disagreement. "Mr. Montgomery," Rodriguez continued, "federal prosecutors are prepared to file criminal charges unless Montgomery Maritime agrees to a comprehensive settlement that includes environmental remediation, community compensation, and oversight of all future operations." During the recess, Preston found himself alone in the courthouse's small chapel, a quiet space he'd never noticed before. He sat in the back pew, staring at the simple wooden cross, trying to process the revelation that his entire fortune was built on his father's crimes. "I didn't expect to find you here." Preston turned to see Keisha standing in the doorway, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "I'm not particularly religious," Preston said. "I just needed somewhere quiet to contemplate how spectacularly my life has imploded." To his surprise, Keisha walked down the aisle and sat 2 pews in front of him, angled so they could speak without shouting. "You really didn't know about the environmental violations?" Preston's laugh was bitter. "I knew my father was ruthless. I knew he cut corners. But this, poisoning water that families swim in, bribing officials who are supposed to protect public safety." He ran his hands through his hair, destroying its perfect styling. "I've spent 20 years trying to live up to his legacy. Turns out his legacy is criminal." Keisha studied his face, searching for deception and finding only exhaustion. "What will you do?" "Accept the settlement, I suppose. Pay whatever they demand. Try to repair the damage." Preston looked at her directly. "And you? I imagine you're savoring this victory." "You'd think so." Keisha turned to face forward, staring at the stained glass windows that cast colored light across the chapel. But watching someone's world fall apart isn't as satisfying as I thought it would be. Why not? I'm the enemy, remember? The privileged trust fund baby who thinks money solves everything. Keisha was quiet for a long moment. Because I've realized you're not a villain. You're just lost. The word hit Preston harder than any legal brief. Lost. You've spent your whole life trying to be someone else's definition of successful. Your father's definition. Society's definition. But you've never figured out who Preston Montgomery actually is when he's not trying to impress anyone. Preston felt something break open in his chest, a dam he'd built years ago to hold back doubts and fears and questions about whether he was worthy of love for who he was rather than what he owned. The night after our first meeting, he said quietly, I couldn't sleep. Not because you were going to cost me money, but because you looked at me and saw through everything I'd built around myself. You saw who I really was, and you weren't impressed. Preston. No, let me finish. You were right about everything. I do think money solves problems. I have surrounded myself with people who tell me what I want to hear. I've lived in a bubble where wealth equals worth, and I've never questioned whether that bubble was protecting me or suffocating me. Keisha turned to face him fully. So what are you going to do about it? Before Preston could answer, his phone buzzed with an urgent message from his legal team. The federal prosecutors had accelerated their timeline. They wanted a decision on the settlement by Friday morning, and the terms were even more severe than expected. $500 million in environmental remediation, $200 million in community compensation, and federal oversight of Montgomery Maritime for the next decade. I have to go, Preston said, standing abruptly. My lawyers need to discuss damage control. As he reached the chapel door, Keisha's voice stopped him. Preston? For what it's worth, I think the person you really are might be worth getting to know. He turned back, studying her face in the colored light from the stained glass. Why would you say that? Because the Preston Montgomery who helped me with my briefcase, who's sitting in a chapel questioning everything he's built, who looked genuinely horrified to learn about his father's crimes, that's not the man I expected to be fighting. Preston wanted to say something profound, something that would bridge the gulf between them. Instead, he just nodded and walked away, carrying her words like a fragile hope he wasn't sure he deserved. That evening, as autumn rain painted streaks down his penthouse windows, Preston made a decision that would change everything. He called his legal team and told them to prepare an offer that would exceed the federal settlement demands. Not because he had to, but because it was right. And for the first time in his life, doing the right thing mattered more than protecting his wealth. Friday morning would bring the moment of truth, and Preston Montgomery was finally ready to discover who he might become when he stopped trying to be who he thought he was supposed to be. Friday morning arrived with news that stunned everyone in the federal courthouse. Preston had not only accepted the government's settlement terms, but had voluntarily increased them by another $300 million, earmarking the extra funds specifically for affordable housing development in Rainier Valley and environmental restoration throughout Puget Sound. Federal investigator Rodriguez read the terms twice, certain there had been a mistake. Mr. Montgomery, you understand this settlement total exceeds $1 billion? Your legal team strongly advised against these additional commitments. Preston, wearing a simple navy suit that somehow made him look younger, more approachable, nodded calmly. I understand completely. And I fired my legal team this morning for trying to minimize our responsibility instead of maximizing our repair efforts. Keisha sat across the conference table, struggling to hide her shock. She'd prepared for battle, expected manipulation or last-minute legal maneuvers. She hadn't prepared for Preston Montgomery to essentially volunteer to bankrupt himself for the sake of justice. After the formal proceedings concluded, Keisha found herself walking beside Preston toward the courthouse exit, both carrying the weight of an unexpected resolution. I don't understand, she said finally. Yesterday you were discussing damage control. Today you've committed to paying 3 times what they demanded. What changed? Preston paused on the courthouse steps, watching Seattle's November drizzle create halos around the street lamps. You want the honest answer or the answer that makes me sound noble? Honest. Always honest. I called my mother last night. First real conversation we've had in 5 years. Preston's voice carried a heaviness Keisha hadn't heard before. Turns out there's a lot about my father and myself that I never understood. Keisha studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched. What did she tell you? That my father wasn't the business genius I thought he was. He was a frightened man who grew up dirt poor in rural Montana, convinced that poverty was a moral failure and wealth was the only proof of worth. Preston's laugh was hollow. Everything I've spent my life admiring about him, the ruthless deal-making, the willingness to crush opposition, the belief that money equals power, it all came from a terrified little boy who never felt like he deserved love. They stood in comfortable silence as office workers hurried past, umbrellas blooming like black flowers against the gray afternoon. My mother also told me something else, Preston continued, about why she and my father divorced when I was 12. Keisha waited, sensing this revelation carried particular weight. She found out he'd been systematically cheating environmental regulations for years, poisoning waterways near low-income communities because cleanup costs cut into profit margins. When she confronted him, he told her that those people didn't matter as much as our family's financial security. Preston's voice hardened. She divorced him not because of infidelity or incompatibility, but because she realized she'd married a man who believed some human lives were worth less than others. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. And you? Keisha asked quietly. What do you believe? Preston turned to face her fully, his gray eyes reflecting the courthouse's granite facade. I believed whatever made me feel superior to the scared kid I used to be. When my father died 3 years ago, I thought inheriting his empire meant I'd finally proven I was worthy of love, respect, success. But sitting in that chapel yesterday, listening to you say I was lost. He paused, gathering courage. I realized I'd spent 20 years becoming someone I don't actually like very much. Keisha felt her professional armor cracking, revealing the woman underneath who recognized pain because she'd carried her own version of it. Preston, can I tell you something? He nodded. The first time I saw you, I didn't just see a privileged billionaire. I saw my ex-fiancé. Preston's eyebrows rose, but he remained silent. His name was Anthony. Corporate lawyer, came from money, everything handed to him on a silver platter. Keisha's voice grew distant. We met during my 2nd year of law school. He was charming, successful, said all the right things about supporting my career and my community work. For 2 years, I convinced myself we were building something real. What happened? I took him home to meet my family in Houston. Watched him interact with my parents, my community, the people I grew up with. Keisha's hands tightened on her briefcase handle. He was polite, proper, said all the appropriate things. But I saw how he looked at my father's calloused hands, heard the condescension when he asked my mother about her domestic work, noticed how he steered conversations away from anything that reminded him I came from a different world than his. Preston winced, recognizing uncomfortable echoes of his own attitudes. The final straw came during our engagement party. One of his law firm partners made a joke about how I was exotic and lucky to have found someone willing to elevate my social status. Anthony laughed. He actually laughed, like my background was something to be overcome rather than honored. Keisha. I realized he didn't love me. He loved the idea of me, the brilliant black woman who could be trophy and equal parts, as long as I never reminded him where I came from or challenged his assumptions about who deserved what in this world. Keisha's voice strengthened. So when I saw you in that boardroom 3 weeks ago, dismissing my community as expendable, treating our legal clinic like an annoyance to be bought off, I saw Anthony. I saw every privileged man who thinks money and status give them the right to determine other people's worth. Preston absorbed her words like physical blows, each one accurate and deserved. And now, Keisha was quiet for a long moment, watching rain create temporary rivers in the courthouse gutters. Now I see someone who's trying to figure out how to be different. Someone who's willing to sacrifice $1 billion to prove he's not his father. But you're still not sure if that's real change or just expensive guilt. Honestly? No, I'm not sure. Keisha's directness was both brutal and refreshing. Change is easy when it costs money. Real change happens when it costs pride, comfort, the approval of people whose opinions you've always valued. Preston considered this. What would real change look like? I don't know. That's something you have to figure out yourself. Keisha adjusted her briefcase strap, preparing to leave. But I will say this, the man who sat in that chapel yesterday, questioning everything he'd built, admitting he was lost? That man is worth getting to know. As Keisha started down the courthouse steps, Preston called after her. Would you consider having dinner with me? Not as opposing counsel, not as a business negotiation. Just as two people who might want to understand each other better. Keisha paused, her hand on the railing. Everything in her professional training screamed that this was a terrible idea. Everything in her heart whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was exactly the kind of terrible idea that led to something beautiful. One dinner, she said finally. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere you can't use your money to impress me. How about Dick's Drive-In on Capitol Hill? Burgers, milkshakes, and absolutely no possibility of impressing anyone with anything other than conversation. For the first time since they'd met, Keisha smiled at Preston Montgomery. Not the polite, professional smile she used in courtrooms, but a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. Tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. And Preston. Yes. Leave the Armani suit at home. As Keisha disappeared into the November evening, Preston stood alone on the courthouse steps, feeling simultaneously terrified and more hopeful than he'd been in years. Tomorrow night, for the first time in his adult life, he would try to be impressive simply by being himself. He had no idea if that would be enough, but for Keisha Washington, he was finally ready to find out. Sometimes the people who challenge us most become the ones who save us. What do you think real change looks like when someone has everything to lose? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe to see if Preston can prove he's worth Keisha's trust. Saturday evening found Preston standing outside Dick's Drive-In on Capitol Hill, wearing dark jeans and a simple gray sweater, feeling more nervous than he had before any billion-dollar merger. The iconic Seattle burger joint buzzed with weekend energy. Families, college students, and couples sharing paper-wrapped burgers and thick milkshakes under neon lighting that had remained unchanged since 1954. When Keisha arrived, Preston barely recognized her. Gone was the professional armor of blazers and briefcases. Instead, she wore fitted dark jeans, brown leather boots, and a cream-colored cable-knit sweater that complemented her warm skin tone. Her hair fell in loose curls around her shoulders, and without the formal setting, she looked younger, more approachable, though no less beautiful. You look. Preston began, then stopped himself from saying something that might sound patronizing. Different. Keisha supplied with a knowing smile. Real, he said honestly. You look real. They ordered at the window, Preston fumbling with the simple process of ordering from a menu with no prices over $5, Keisha watching with barely concealed amusement as he tried to calculate appropriate tip amounts for counter service. You've never done this before, have you? she asked as they found a picnic table under the outdoor heaters. Define this. Ordered your own food from a place that doesn't have waitstaff. Had a casual meal that costs less than your monthly gym membership. Sat at a plastic table. Preston unwrapped his burger with the careful attention of someone performing surgery. You make me sound completely out of touch. Aren't you? The question might have stung coming from anyone else, but Keisha's tone held curiosity rather than judgment. Preston considered it seriously. Probably. But I'd like to learn. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Seattle's Saturday night unfold around them. A group of teenagers shared fries while debating Marvel movies. An elderly couple split a milkshake, their hands intertwined across their small table. Young parents corralled energetic children while stealing bites of burgers between mediating sibling disputes. Tell me about your family, Preston said finally. Your real family, not the professional biography. Keisha wiped her hands on a napkin, considering how much truth to share. My father, Kenneth, worked construction for 32 years before his back gave out. My mother, Carol, cleaned houses during the day and took online accounting classes at night for 8 years to become a bookkeeper. They've been married 37 years, and they still hold hands when they think nobody's watching. Sounds like a good marriage. The best. They taught me that love isn't about what someone can give you, it's about who you become when you're with them. Keisha's voice softened. My father used to come home covered in concrete dust, exhausted from 10-hour days, but he'd still help me with homework every night. Said education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from me. Preston felt a familiar pang of envy for the kind of family stability he'd never experienced. What about siblings? One brother, Kevin. He's a firefighter in Houston, married to his high school sweetheart, 3 kids under 8. Keisha laughed. He thinks I'm crazy for moving to Seattle, says I'm too far from family support systems. But I needed to prove I could build something of my own, away from everyone's expectations. What were their expectations? That I'd marry someone safe, someone approved by the community, have children, and stay close to home. All good things, but... She paused, searching for words. I needed to know who I was when nobody was watching, when I couldn't rely on family networks or familiar environments. Preston nodded, understanding more than she might expect. And the Coast Guard? 4 years, stationed in San Diego. Best and worst experience of my life. Keisha's expression grew complex. I learned I was stronger than I knew, capable of leadership under pressure, good in crisis situations. But I also learned that institutions don't change easily, that being excellent isn't always enough when you're the only black woman in most rooms. Is that why you left? Partly. But mostly because I realized my real calling was advocacy law, fighting for communities that don't have resources to fight for themselves. She met his eyes. The Coast Guard taught me discipline and courage. Law school gave me weapons. The legal clinic lets me use both for something that matters. Preston absorbed this, recognizing the contrast with his own privileged path. Can I confess something? Go ahead. I've never had to fight for anything that really mattered. Everything in my life, education, career opportunities, social connections, was handed to me before I even knew I wanted it. His voice carried genuine shame. Until I met you, I didn't realize how much courage it takes to build a life from scratch, to stand up for principles when you have everything to lose. Keisha studied his face, seeing vulnerability she hadn't expected. What do you want to fight for now? The chance to become someone worth knowing. The opportunity to use my resources for something beyond ego and profit. Preston hesitated, then pushed forward. The possibility that someone like you might eventually see something in me worth caring about. The honesty hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Around them, the ordinary magic of Saturday night continued. Conversations, laughter, the simple pleasure of shared meals and human connection. Preston, can I ask you something personal? Anything. Have you ever been in love? Real love, not just infatuation or convenience. Preston was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I thought I was twice. Once in college, once about 5 years ago. But looking back. He shook his head. I think I was in love with the idea of being in love, with having someone beautiful and accomplished to display at social events. I don't think I ever truly knew either woman, and I'm not sure they knew me. What went wrong? I never let them see who I really was. And I never bothered to discover who they really were beneath the surface. Preston's smile was rueful. Hard to build lasting love on such shallow foundations. And now I'm sitting at a plastic table with a woman who's seen me at my worst and still agreed to share a burger with me. Someone who challenges everything I thought I knew about myself and makes me want to be better than I am. He met her gaze directly. For the first time in my life, I'm more interested in who someone is than what they can do for my image. Keisha felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. This version of Preston, uncertain, honest, willing to examine his own flaws, was far more dangerous to her emotional equilibrium than the arrogant billionaire she'd been prepared to battle. What scares you most? She asked softly. That I'll discover I'm too damaged by privilege and entitlement to ever truly connect with someone real. That I'll hurt you the way I've hurt others, through selfishness or ignorance or the simple inability to see past my own perspective. Preston's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That you'll realize I'm not worth the effort. And what excites you most? The possibility that I'm wrong about all of that. That maybe it's not too late to learn how to love someone properly, to be worthy of being loved in return. He paused. The chance to discover who I might become if I stop trying to prove I'm better than everyone else and start trying to be good enough for the right person. As the evening wound down, they walked slowly toward their cars, neither ready for the night to end. The November air was crisp and clear, city lights reflecting off Elliott Bay in the distance. Keisha, would you? Preston started, then stopped himself. What? Would you consider spending Thanksgiving with me? Not at some fancy restaurant or catered event. Maybe we could cook something together, just the two of us. I'd like to learn how to make a meal that doesn't involve a staff of 12. Keisha smiled, feeling something warm and hopeful blooming in her chest despite every rational warning her mind was broadcasting. I'll teach you how to make my grandmother's cornbread dressing. But you have to promise to actually get your hands dirty. Deal. As they reached their cars, Preston turned to her one more time. Keisha, thank you. For dinner, for giving me a chance, for seeing something in me that might be worth saving. Don't thank me yet, she said, but her tone was gentle. The real work starts now. Driving home through Seattle's Saturday night traffic, both Preston and Keisha carried the same thought. Somewhere between legal battles and fast food dinners, between confessions and cornbread promises, something had shifted. Something that felt like the beginning of a story neither had expected to write, but both were beginning to hope might have a beautiful ending. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Seattle weather that matched the nervous energy coursing through Preston's penthouse. He'd dismissed his staff for the long weekend, wanting complete privacy for what felt like the most important meal of his life. The kitchen, a monument to stainless steel and marble that he'd never actually used, now held bags of groceries he'd personally selected at Pike Place Market, guided by Keisha's detailed shopping list. When she arrived at 10 a.m., carrying a worn recipe box and wearing a burgundy sweater that made her skin glow, Preston felt his heart do something irregular in his chest. Ready to learn how real people cook, she asked, setting down her box and surveying the pristine kitchen with amusement. Define ready. Keisha laughed, the sound filling corners of his home that had never heard genuine joy. First lesson: cooking is about love, not perfection. My grandmother always said you can taste whether food was made with hands or with heart. For the next 4 hours, Preston discovered muscles he'd never used. Kneading cornbread, chopping vegetables, stirring gravies that required constant attention and intuitive adjustments. Keisha moved through his kitchen like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, teaching him to taste as he went, to trust his instincts over precise measurements. More sage, she instructed, watching him season the dressing. Cooking is like law, you learn the rules first, then you learn when to break them. Preston added herbs with the focused concentration he usually reserved for merger negotiations. Like this. Perfect. Their hands brushed as she reached for the same spoon, and the simple contact sent electricity through both of them. The afternoon unfolded with easy intimacy, Preston learning to carve turkey while Keisha shared stories of her family's Thanksgiving traditions, both of them stealing tastes and laughing when Preston nearly burned the rolls because he was too focused on watching her explain the proper way to make gravy. "This is the best Thanksgiving I've ever had," Preston said as they finally sat down to eat at his formal dining table, now covered with mismatched serving dishes and the comfortable chaos of home cooking. "Even though half the food is slightly overcooked and you've got flour in your hair?" Preston reached up self-consciously, and Keisha gently brushed the white powder from his dark strands. The gesture was so natural, so tender, that they both froze, suddenly aware of how close they'd grown, how much had changed between them. "Keisha, I..." Her phone rang, shrill and insistent. She glanced at the screen, frowning. "It's Jerome. I should take this." "Keisha, thank God." Jerome's voice was tight with urgency, loud enough for Preston to hear. "Turn on Channel 7 News. Now." Preston grabbed his remote, flipping to the local station where a perfectly groomed anchor was delivering the evening report. Shocking revelations about Montgomery Maritime's expansion project have emerged today. Documents leaked to this station reveal that the company has been aware of significant environmental contamination at the proposed site for over 8 months, information that was allegedly concealed from city planners and community representatives. The blood drained from Keisha's face as she watched footage of the construction site, followed by internal Montgomery Maritime emails discussing containment strategies and acceptable risk thresholds. The leaked document suggests that Preston Montgomery personally approved moving forward with construction despite knowing about groundwater contamination that could affect local drinking water. Preston's hands shook as he reached for his phone, dialing his head of environmental compliance. "Get me Gregory Morrison. Now." "Sir," came the nervous voice on speakerphone. "Mr. Morrison submitted his resignation this morning. Left a note saying he couldn't be part of a cover-up anymore." Keisha stared at Preston, her warm brown eyes now cold with betrayal and disbelief. "You knew. All this time, while you were playing at being reformed, while you were cooking Thanksgiving dinner and talking about becoming a better man, you knew you were poisoning my community." "Keisha, wait. 8 months." Her voice rose with each word. 8 months you've known that your project could contaminate the water supply for 3,000 families, and you said nothing. You let me believe you were changing, that you cared about more than profit. Preston stood, reaching toward her, but she stepped back as if his touch might burn. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I had no idea Morrison was hiding this information." "Don't." Keisha's voice was deadly quiet now, more frightening than shouting. "Don't you dare lie to me. Not after today. Not after everything you said about wanting to be worthy of love." She grabbed her coat and purse, moving toward the door with quick, angry steps. Preston followed, desperate. "Keisha, please. Let me explain. Let me fix this." She whirled around, and Preston saw tears of rage glittering in her eyes. Fix this? How exactly do you plan to fix 8 months of deception? How do you fix the fact that while I was falling for your act, you were knowingly putting children at risk? It wasn't an act. Everything about you is an act. The words exploded from her like a dam bursting. The reformed billionaire, the man learning to cook, the person who wanted to be worthy of love, all of it was just another manipulation. Another way to neutralize the threat I represented to your precious project. That's not true, isn't it? Isn't it convenient that right when I was becoming a real problem for you, you suddenly discovered your conscience? Started asking me out, showing up at community meetings, playing the role of the repentant rich boy. Preston felt something breaking inside his chest. You think I manipulated you? You think everything between us was calculated? I think you're exactly what I thought you were when we first met. A selfish, entitled man who believes his money gives him the right to buy or destroy anything that stands in his way. Including me. Keisha. Save it for your lawyers, Preston. Because as of tomorrow morning, you're going to need them. She stormed toward the elevator, Preston following. What does that mean? It means I'm filing criminal charges for environmental fraud and reckless endangerment. It means I'm calling every news outlet in the Pacific Northwest. It means I'm going to destroy you and your company the way you tried to destroy my community. The elevator doors opened, and Keisha stepped inside, turning to face him one last time. The woman who had laughed in his kitchen just hours earlier was gone, replaced by the fierce legal warrior he'd first encountered months ago. And Preston? If you ever, and I mean ever, try to contact me again outside of official legal proceedings, I'll file harassment charges so fast it'll make your head spin. We're done. Completely, permanently done. The elevator doors closed on Preston's stricken face, leaving him alone in the hallway of his empty penthouse, surrounded by the lingering sense of their ruined Thanksgiving dinner. For the next 3 days, Preston's world imploded with surgical precision. News vans camped outside Montgomery Maritime headquarters. Environmental groups organized protests. The Seattle City Council called emergency hearings. Stock prices plummeted as investors fled the scandal. But none of that compared to the hollowness in his chest where hope had briefly lived. He replayed every moment of their time together, searching for signs he'd missed, wondering if anything between them had been real or if he'd simply projected his own desperate longing onto a woman who was always planning his destruction. On Monday morning, alone in his office while lawyers managed the crisis, Preston stared out at Elliott Bay and finally understood what it meant to lose something that mattered. For the first time in his privileged life, he'd found someone worth changing for, worth fighting for, worth becoming better for. And he'd lost her through his own cowardice and the toxic legacy of everything he'd built his identity upon. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to preserve his empire, he'd destroyed the one thing that might have made that empire worth having. Preston hadn't slept in 4 days. He stood in his office at 3 a.m. on December 4th, watching the harbor lights blur through exhausted eyes while his legal team worked around the clock in the conference room down the hall. Coffee cups and takeout containers littered every surface, the controlled chaos of a company fighting for survival. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, stubble darkening his jaw, his usually pristine shirt wrinkled and stained, his steel-gray eyes hollow with something deeper than fatigue. For 42 years, he believed that every problem had a solution if you threw enough money or influence at it. But how do you buy back someone's trust? How do you purchase forgiveness from the woman you love when you've proven yourself unworthy of either? Sir. Bradley appeared in the doorway, looking as exhausted as Preston felt. The board is demanding another emergency meeting. They want to discuss leadership transitions. Preston's laugh held no humor. They want to discuss throwing me overboard to save the ship. The environmental violations could result in federal charges, sir. The board thinks if you step down voluntarily. Get out. Sir, I said get out, Bradley, and cancel all my appointments for the rest of the week. Alone again, Preston pulled out his phone and scrolled to Keisha's contact information. His thumb hovered over her name for the 100th time in 4 days. She'd been clear about not contacting her, but every instinct screamed at him to fight for what they'd had, to make her understand that his feelings for her were the only real thing in his carefully constructed life. Instead, he opened his laptop and began typing an email that would never be sent. Keisha, I know you never want to hear from me again, but I need you to know that everything between us was real. Every laugh, every conversation, every moment I let my guard down with you, that was the truest version of myself I've ever been. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve another chance, but I won't let you believe that my feelings for you were calculated. You changed me. You made me want to be worthy of love, even if I failed at actually becoming that man. He deleted the email without saving it and walked to his private bathroom, staring at his reflection in the mirror. When had he become someone who could look at environmental contamination reports and choose profit over people? When had he stopped seeing the human cost of his decisions? The answer was harder to swallow than his pride. He'd always been that person. Keisha hadn't revealed his true nature. She'd shown him how far he'd fallen from any version of himself worth loving. Meanwhile, across town, Keisha sat in her office at 5 a.m., surrounded by legal briefs and environmental impact studies, building the case that would dismantle Preston Montgomery's empire piece by piece. She'd been working non-stop since storming out of his penthouse, driven by a fury that burned hotter than exhaustion. Jerome had tried to send her home twice, but she couldn't rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Preston's face when she accused him of manipulation, the genuine shock and pain that had flickered across his features before his walls slammed back into place. She hated that part of her wondered if his reaction had been real, if she'd wounded someone who actually cared for her. Stop it, she muttered to herself, highlighting another damning passage about groundwater contamination levels. He made his choice 8 months ago when he decided to hide this information. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Baby girl, saw the news. Are you okay? Keisha's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Was she okay? She'd uncovered the evidence needed to protect her community and hold Montgomery Maritime accountable. She should feel victorious. Instead, she felt hollow, like part of her had been carved out and left behind in Preston's kitchen while they cooked Thanksgiving dinner together. I'm fine, Mama. Just busy with the case. You know I raised you to fight for what's right. But I also raised you to fight for your own happiness. Make sure you know the difference. Keisha stared at the message, her mother's words hitting deeper than intended. Was she fighting for justice, or was she running from the terrifying vulnerability of having let someone past her defenses only to discover she'd misjudged them completely? Her computer pinged with an email from an unexpected sender. Gregory Morrison, Montgomery Maritime's former head of environmental compliance. Ms. Washington, I've been following your case against Montgomery Maritime. I believe I have information that might be valuable to your legal proceedings. Could we meet? There are things about Preston Montgomery and this contamination issue that you need to know. Things that might change your perspective on who knew what and when. Keisha frowned, rereading the message. What could Morrison possibly tell her that would change anything? Preston was the CEO. The contamination happened under his watch. He'd approved moving forward with construction despite the environmental risks. But her legal training demanded she hear all evidence before reaching final conclusions. She typed back, "Meet me at Cafe Vita on Capitol Hill at 2 p.m. today." Later that afternoon, Gregory Morrison looked like a man carrying the weight of professional failure. Thin and nervous, with graying hair and tired eyes, he clutched his coffee cup like a lifeline as Keisha settled across from him in the busy cafe. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd agree to hear me out." "I'm listening." Morrison pulled out a thick folder and opened it carefully. I've worked in environmental compliance for 15 years. Montgomery Maritime hired me 18 months ago specifically because of my reputation for thoroughness and ethical standards. Keisha's expression remained neutral, but she leaned forward slightly. When we first discovered the contamination at the construction site, I immediately notified Preston Montgomery and recommended halting the project pending full environmental remediation. That was 8 months ago. Right. He chose to ignore your recommendations and move forward anyway. No. Morrison shook his head emphatically. He didn't. Preston ordered an immediate halt to all construction and authorized me to hire the best environmental remediation firm on the West Coast, regardless of cost. He said, and I quote, "I don't care if it costs us $50 million and delays the project 2 years. We're not moving forward until every contamination issue is resolved." Keisha felt something cold settle in her stomach. Then why? Because I lied to him. Morrison's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. For the past 6 months, I've been submitting falsified reports showing that remediation was complete when it wasn't. Preston thinks the site has been clean for months. The cafe noise faded to white static around Keisha as Morrison continued. My daughter needs experimental cancer treatment that insurance won't cover. Montgomery Maritime's health plan has a special provision for experimental procedures, but only for employees with at least 2 years of service. I was 6 months short when Isabella was diagnosed. Morrison's hands shook as he pulled out medical records and falsified environmental reports. I told myself I'd fix everything after Isabella's treatment was complete. I'd come clean, face the consequences. But then the news broke, and I realized Preston was going to take the blame for my lies. Keisha stared at the evidence spread across the table. Genuine environmental reports showing ongoing contamination, followed by months of Morrison's falsified documents claiming the site was clean. Her phone buzzed with urgent texts from Jerome, but she couldn't look away from the papers that changed everything. "Why are you telling me this now?" she whispered. "Because Preston Montgomery isn't perfect, and he's made plenty of mistakes in his business practices. But he didn't knowingly poison your community. And he doesn't deserve to lose everything because I was too much of a coward to tell him the truth." Morrison stood, leaving the folder on the table. "I've already submitted my resignation and full confession to the EPA and the Seattle Police Department. I'll face whatever consequences come from my choices. But I won't let a good man be destroyed for my sins." As Morrison walked away, Keisha sat frozen in her chair, staring at evidence that shattered everything she believed about Preston's betrayal. The contamination was real, the danger to her community was real, but Preston's knowledge of it wasn't. She'd accused him of manipulation and deception when he'd been as much a victim of Morrison's lies as anyone else. She'd called their relationship a calculated move when Preston had been genuinely trying to change, genuinely falling for her just as she'd been falling for him. Her phone rang, Jerome again, but she couldn't answer. How do you rebuild something you've destroyed with words that can't be taken back? How do you ask forgiveness from someone you've already pushed away? For the first time since Thanksgiving, Keisha Washington didn't know how to fight for what mattered most. The December rain hammered against the windows of Keisha's apartment as she sat on her burgundy velvet couch. Morrison's evidence folder spread across her coffee table like accusations she could no longer deny. 3 days had passed since learning the truth, and she'd barely moved except to call Jerome and explain everything. Her natural hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she wore an oversized gray sweater that had belonged to her father. Her comfort armor when the world felt too complicated to navigate. She drafted 17 different text messages to Preston, deleted them all. How do you begin an apology for destroying someone's character based on lies? How do you ask for forgiveness when you've proven yourself capable of believing the worst about someone you claim to love? Her doorbell rang at 9 p.m., interrupting her spiral of self-recrimination. Through the peephole, she saw Jerome holding 2 bags of Thai food and wearing his most determined expression. You're not answering your phone, you missed our strategy meeting, and Mrs. Johnson said you haven't been by the neighborhood in 3 days, he said, pushing past her into the apartment. So we're going to eat pad thai and figure out how to fix this mess. There's nothing to fix, Jerome. I destroyed everything based on false information. Jerome set the food on her kitchen counter and turned to face her, his dark eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. Keisha, I've watched you fight impossible cases for 3 years. You've never given up on anything worth saving. So tell me, is Preston Montgomery worth saving? The question hit her like cold water. She sank onto her couch, pulling her knees to her chest. Yes. But that doesn't matter now. You should have seen his face when I accused him of using me. I called him a liar and a manipulator when he was being honest about everything that mattered. So tell him that. He'll never believe me. Why should he? I didn't believe him when it counted. Jerome opened the pad thai containers, the smell of peanut sauce and lime filling the apartment. Because sometimes people who love each other screw up royally, and sometimes they find ways to forgive each other anyway. Keisha looked up sharply. I never said I loved him. Honey, you've been crying over environmental reports for 3 days. You think that's about professional disappointment? Before Keisha could respond, her phone rang. Bradley Morrison's name appeared on the screen, Preston's assistant calling at 9:30 p.m. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she answered. Ms. Washington? I'm sorry to call so late, but I thought you should know. Preston's in the hospital. The world tilted sideways. What happened? He collapsed during a board meeting this afternoon. Exhaustion and dehydration, the doctors said. He's been working around the clock trying to fix the environmental situation, spending his own money on remediation efforts. He refuses to see anyone, including his family. But he asked me to give you a message if you called. What message? He said to tell you that Morrison came forward, and Preston knows you were protecting your community based on the information you had. He said he doesn't blame you for not trusting him because he hadn't given you enough reasons to. Keisha closed her eyes, tears finally spilling over. Which hospital? Swedish Medical Center, but Ms. Washington, he's not accepting visitors. I'll be right there. She hung up and grabbed her jacket, ignoring Jerome's knowing smile. 40 minutes later, Swedish Medical Center. Preston lay in the hospital bed looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his face pale against the white pillowcase. Dark circles shadowed his gray eyes, and his strong hands rested limply on the blanket. The sight of him vulnerable and alone sent a sharp pain through her chest. The nurse had tried to turn her away, but Keisha's 3 years of legal advocacy had taught her how to be persistently persuasive. Now she stood in his doorway, unsure whether her presence would help or hurt. Preston's eyes opened as if he sensed her watching. For a moment, neither spoke. Then his voice, rougher than usual from exhaustion. Keisha, you shouldn't be here. Probably not, she agreed, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. But I needed to apologize. You don't owe me anything. I owe you everything. She moved closer to his bed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I know about Morrison. I know you tried to stop construction 8 months ago. I know you've been spending your own money on remediation efforts. And I know I accused you of things you never did. Preston struggled to sit up, and Keisha rushed forward to help adjust his pillows. The brief contact, her hands on his shoulders, sent electricity through both of them. The contamination was real, Preston said quietly. Your community was in danger. You were protecting people who depend on you. I understand why you assumed the worst. No, you don't understand. Keisha pulled the visitor's chair close to his bed and sat down, finally meeting his eyes directly. I assumed the worst because I was scared of how much I cared about you. It was easier to believe you were manipulating me than to believe someone like you could genuinely love someone like me. Someone like me? Rich, powerful, used to getting whatever you want. Someone like you. A legal aid lawyer from Rainier Valley who can barely afford rent. Preston reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. Keisha, in the past 2 months, you've shown me more about honor, integrity, and genuine care for others than I learned in 42 years of business success. You made me want to be worthy of you, not because of what you lack, but because of everything you are. Tears streamed down her face. I called you a liar when you were telling me the truth about your feelings. I accused you of manipulation when you were falling in love just like I was. Were. Past tense. She looked at their joined hands, his pale fingers intertwined with her darker ones, and felt her heart crack open completely. AM. Present tense. Terrifyingly present tense. Preston's smile was soft and real, reaching his eyes for the first time since Thanksgiving. I love you too, Keisha Washington. And not because you're a brilliant lawyer or a fierce advocate, though you are both. I love you because you see the best in people while refusing to accept anything less than their best efforts. You made me want to become someone worthy of that vision. You already are that someone. No, but I'm learning to be. With your help, if you'll have me. Keisha leaned forward and kissed him softly, tasting forgiveness and new beginnings. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. What happens now? She whispered. Now we fix the contamination properly. Now I testify on Morrison's behalf at his sentencing hearing. He made terrible choices for understandable reasons. Now Montgomery Maritime implements new environmental oversight policies that you helped design. And now we figure out what it looks like for a shipping billionaire and a community lawyer to build something beautiful together. The media will have a field day. Let them. I'm tired of caring what people think when the only opinion that matters is yours. Keisha settled into the chair beside his bed, still holding his hand. The board's going to try to force you out. Probably. But I've got excellent legal counsel now. His grin was both tender and mischievous. Besides, it turns out I'm not quite as powerless as they think. 43% ownership stake has its advantages. Preston. Yeah. When you get out of here, I want to cook for you. Real cooking, not takeout containers. I want to show you my world the way you showed me yours. I'd love that. But fair warning, I'm a terrible sous chef. Good thing I'm an excellent teacher. 2 weeks later, Christmas Eve. The Rainier Valley Community Center buzzed with holiday celebration as families gathered for the annual Christmas dinner. Keisha stood in the kitchen, wearing a bright red dress and coordinating with volunteers to serve plates of ham, mashed potatoes, and green bean casserole to over 200 neighbors. Preston appeared at her elbow, sleeves rolled up and an apron tied around his waist, looking completely out of place and perfectly content. He'd been volunteering here for the past week, learning names and stories, listening more than he spoke. Mrs. Johnson wants to know if you saved room for her sweet potato pie, he said, his voice warm with genuine affection for the elderly woman who'd become one of his unexpected teachers about community and resilience. Always room for Mrs. Johnson's pie. Keisha smiled up at him, still amazed by how naturally he'd integrated into her world, how he asked questions without judgment and contributed without condescension. Marcus Johnson tugged on Preston's apron. Mr. Preston, you coming to our New Year's party? Wouldn't miss it, buddy. As the evening wound down, Preston and Keisha walked hand in hand through the twinkling lights of the community center's Christmas tree. Snow had begun to fall, dusting Seattle in unexpected holiday magic. Jerome thinks you're going to propose, Keisha said suddenly. Jerome talks too much. Preston's eyes sparkled with mischief. Besides, I'm waiting for the right moment. What would make it the right moment? Preston stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression growing serious. When I know for certain that you believe in us as much as I do. When you trust me enough to build something permanent together. When you're ready to let me love you for the rest of our lives. Keisha reached up to cup his face in her hands, snowflakes catching in his dark hair. Preston Montgomery, I believed in us the moment you showed up at that community meeting and actually listened instead of talked. I trusted you the moment you let me see you cry over your father's letter. And I've been ready to let you love me since the night you taught me to make your grandmother's biscuits. Is that a yes to a question I haven't asked yet? That's a yes to whatever question you're brave enough to ask. Preston laughed, pulling her close and spinning her around in the snow while Christmas lights twinkled overhead and the sound of community celebration filled the air around them. When he set her down, he kissed her deeply, tasting joy and promise and the beginning of forever. Merry Christmas, Keisha Washington. Merry Christmas, Preston Montgomery. Thank you for showing me that love doesn't have to be predictable to be real. As they walked back toward the community center, where Mrs. Johnson was saving them both slices of sweet potato pie, Preston squeezed Keisha's hand. You know what I learned from all this? What's that? Sometimes the person who challenges everything you believe about yourself turns out to be exactly the person you need to become who you're meant to be. Keisha smiled, thinking about the journey from adversaries to lovers, from mistrust to the kind of deep, abiding love that transforms everything it touches. I think that's the best Christmas present I've ever received. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.